The ghost towns of inland Florida hold secrets most people never knew existed. Once, these communities thrived miles away from the ocean, safe from the storm surge that haunted coastal cities. Families believed they had found paradise in the heartland, far from the violent waves. But what the hurricanes left behind in these forgotten towns tells a story nobody saw coming. Not a single wave touched these streets, yet today they stand empty, rotting under the relentless Florida sun. Houses with families inside one year, hollow shells the next. What really happened when the storms passed? Why did entire communities vanish from places the ocean never reached? Stay with me, because the truth behind these abandoned towns reveals something far more disturbing than wind and rain. Most people think hurricanes only destroy coastlines. They imagine the dramatic footage of waves crashing over boardwalks, luxury hotels collapsing into the sea, beachfront mansions reduced to splinters. That is what makes the news. That is what fills our screens every storm season. But inland Florida tells a different story, one hidden from cameras and forgotten by headlines. These ghost towns emerged not from the ocean's fury, but from something slower, something that crept through the land like a plague. The hurricanes were just the beginning. They were the spark that ignited a chain of events nobody predicted, a domino effect that would hollow out entire communities and leave behind towns that look like movie sets for the apocalypse. Empty gas stations with faded signs still promising the cheapest fuel. Schools where desks remain in neat rows waiting for children who will never return. Libraries with books still on shelves, gathering dust in the humid air. These places did not die in one dramatic moment. They bled out slowly. And that is what makes their story so haunting. Let us go back to when these towns were alive. Picture the late 1990s and early 2000s, when inland Florida represented the American dream for thousands of families. Cities like Arcadia, Okeechobee, and Moorhaven were not flashy. They would never compete with Miami's glamour or Orlando's theme park magic, but they offered something valuable: affordability, space, and the promise of a quieter life. Young couples bought their first homes here. Retirees stretched their pensions further than they ever could on the coast. The citrus industry still thrived, orange groves stretching as far as the eye could see, their sweet scent perfuming the air for miles. Cattle ranches dotted the landscape, reminding everyone that Florida was not just beaches and retirement communities. This was working Florida, authentic Florida, where people built lives around crops and seasons rather than tourist dollars and real estate speculation. Main streets bustled every Saturday morning. Hardware stores knew their customers by name. High school football games drew the entire town. These communities had roots, history, identity. They had survived previous hurricanes with minimal damage, reinforcing the belief that inland meant safe. After Hurricane Andrew devastated the coast in 1992, many people actually moved inland, seeking refuge from the ocean's reach. The towns grew. New developments appeared. Elementary schools expanded. It felt like progress, like security. Then came the storms of 2004. Hurricane Charley arrived first in August, a compact but ferocious storm that crossed the peninsula from coast to coast. Unlike most hurricanes that weaken rapidly over land, Charley maintained dangerous winds far inland. Towns that had barely prepared suddenly found themselves in the path of a Category 3 hurricane. Trees that had stood for a century snapped like twigs. Roofs peeled away from homes built in the 1950s, when building codes were suggestions rather than requirements. Power lines collapsed, plunging entire counties into darkness. But the real devastation was not the wind itself. It was what the wind revealed. How unprepared these communities were. How fragile their infrastructure had become. How dependent they were on systems that could fail in an instant. Charley was followed by Francis, then Jeanne, then Ivan, all within 6 weeks. 4 major hurricanes in one season, each one taking a different path, but all of them punishing inland Florida. The orange groves suffered catastrophic losses. Insurance companies began calculating damages in the billions. And slowly, quietly, people started to leave. At first, the exodus seemed temporary. Families moved in with relatives while they rebuilt. Workers sought employment in areas with functioning infrastructure. But rebuilding required money, and money required insurance. And insurance companies had different plans. After the 2004 season, insurers reassessed their risk models for all of Florida. Premiums skyrocketed, not just on the coast, but throughout the interior. Homeowners who had paid $300 a year suddenly faced bills of $3,000 or more. Small businesses watched their coverage quadruple. Many simply could not afford it. They made a choice: abandon insurance and gamble on the weather, or sell and move somewhere more affordable. Meanwhile, the citrus industry faced its own crisis. The hurricanes had not just knocked fruit from trees, they had stressed the groves, making them vulnerable to disease. Citrus canker and greening disease spread through weakened trees like wildfire. Within a few years, production in some counties dropped by 80%. Jobs disappeared. The economic foundation of these towns crumbled. Young people who might have stayed to work the family grove found nothing to inherit but dying trees and mounting debt. Then came the real estate collapse of 2008. Property values plummeted nationwide, but in these struggling inland towns, the bottom fell out completely. Homes purchased for $150,000 in 2005 now struggled to sell for $40,000. Underwater mortgages trapped families who wanted to leave but could not afford to. Banks foreclosed on properties they did not even want, knowing they would sit empty for years. The towns began to empty out like a slow-motion evacuation. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, relentlessly. One family would leave, their house would sit empty, the yard would overgrow, and soon the neighbors on both sides would list their properties too. Nobody wants to be the last person on a dying street. The infrastructure started to fail in ways that made national news seem abstract here. Roads developed potholes that never got filled because the tax base had shrunk too small to maintain basic services. Streetlights went dark and stayed dark. The post office in one town reduced its hours, then closed entirely. A hospital shut down its emergency room, meaning the nearest trauma care was now 40 miles away. Schools consolidated, busing children longer distances, then closed altogether when enrollment fell below sustainable levels. But wait, here is where the story becomes even more troubling. The hurricanes that followed 2004 continued the pattern. Irma in 2017 cut straight up the peninsula, devastating inland communities already weakened from the previous decade of decline. Mobile homes that housed farm workers and retirees were destroyed by the thousands. Many were never replaced. The people just left. Michael in 2018, though primarily a coastal storm, sent its remnants through already battered interior counties. Each storm was another nail in the coffin. Insurance became nearly impossible to obtain. The few companies still offering coverage charged premiums so high that only the wealthy could afford protection. A vicious cycle emerged. Without insurance, banks would not write mortgages. Without mortgages, people could not buy homes. Without buyers, property values remained depressed, and without property tax revenue, local governments could not provide services. The towns were trapped in a death spiral, and everyone knew it. Drive through these areas today, and the abandonment is surreal. In Arcadia, once a thriving cattle town, entire blocks stand vacant. Historic downtown buildings from the early 20th century deteriorate behind boarded windows. The famous rodeo grounds still host events, but the crowds have thinned, and the surrounding town feels hollow, like a body whose heart still beats, but whose limbs have gone numb. In Moore Haven, founded in 1916 as a planned community on Lake Okeechobee, the main street looks like a time capsule from 2005. Businesses closed so suddenly their signs remain intact, still advertising deals and hours that will never be honored again. A restaurant with tables still set, visible through dusty windows. A clothing store with mannequins frozen in outdated fashions. These are not ruins in the traditional sense. They are too recent, too familiar. They look like places people just stepped away from for a moment and never came back. The homes are perhaps the most haunting element. Entire subdivisions built during the boom years now sit empty. Not just a few scattered houses, but entire streets where not a single property shows signs of life. Swimming pools filled with black water and algae. Driveways cracked and overtaken by weeds. Mailboxes rusting, their doors hanging open like silent screams. Some homes have been stripped by scavengers, taking copper pipes and air conditioning units. Others remained eerily intact, as if the families simply vanished. In one neighborhood outside Okeechobee, you can walk down a street of 20 houses and not encounter another soul. No dogs barking, no cars passing, just the sound of wind through pine trees and the occasional creak of a loose shutter. The silence is oppressive, unnatural. Human settlements should have sound, activity, life. These places feel like graveyards without headstones. Nature is reclaiming the land with remarkable speed. Florida's subtropical climate accelerates decay. What might take decades in drier climates happens in just a few years here. Vines engulf fences and climb walls. Palmettos push through cracked concrete. Trees sprout in gutters and foundations. Buildings that seemed solid 10 years ago now tilt at unnatural angles as the soft Florida soil shifts beneath them. The humid air penetrates everything, breeding mold that spreads through walls like cancer. Paint peels in great sheets. Metal rusts to lace. Even concrete begins to crumble as moisture and plant roots break it apart molecule by molecule. In another 50 years, some of these structures will be completely consumed, returned to the swampland that existed before humans ever arrived. The land remembers what it was before we built our towns and will patiently wait to reclaim it. The human cost is measured not just in empty buildings, but in fractured communities and broken dreams. Families who had lived in the same town for 3 or 4 generations scattered across the state or left Florida entirely. The social fabric that held these places together unraveled. Churches lost their congregations. Veterans halls closed. Little league fields grew over. The institutions that give a community identity and continuity simply ceased to exist. For those who remain, often the elderly or those too poor to leave, life has become increasingly difficult. Basic services that people in cities take for granted have disappeared. The nearest grocery store might be 30 miles away. Medical care requires long drives on dangerous rural roads. Internet service is spotty or non-existent, cutting residents off from the digital economy and modern communication. They live in what amounts to domestic exile. American citizens abandoned in their own country because their towns no longer generate enough economic activity to justify investment. Yet the official story often ignores these ghost towns entirely. When politicians and media discuss hurricane recovery in Florida, the focus remains on coastal cities. Billions flow into rebuilding beachfront properties and reinforcing waterfronts. Inland communities receive a fraction of the attention and resources. This disparity is not accidental. Coastal Florida generates enormous tourist revenue and houses wealthy residents with political influence. Inland Florida represents agriculture and working-class communities with little lobbying power. The economic calculation is brutal but simple. Rebuilding Miami Beach generates more return on investment than reviving Moore Haven. So the ghost towns remain ghosts, occasionally mentioned in academic studies or documentary films, but largely forgotten by the broader public. Politicians visit after major storms, make promises, and then move on. The federal disaster aid that does arrive often falls short of what is needed, gets tangled in bureaucracy, or fails to reach the people who need it most. Some areas have attempted revitalization, with mixed results. A few towns have marketed themselves to artists and alternative communities looking for cheap property and space. In certain neighborhoods, young people have bought homes for pennies on the dollar and are slowly renovating them. Community gardens have replaced failed subdivisions in some locations. A handful of small businesses have found niche markets, serving the scattered population that remains, or catering to curious visitors drawn by the area's strange desolation. But these bright spots are exceptions in a landscape of decline. For every success story, there are 10 more blocks that continue to deteriorate, 10 more families that give up and leave, 10 more businesses that close forever. The fundamental problems remain unsolved. Climate change is making hurricanes more intense and unpredictable. Insurance costs continue to rise, jobs remain scarce, and the economic model that sustained these towns for generations no longer functions. The environmental implications add another layer to this tragedy. As these communities empty out, the land they occupied becomes a no man's land. Too developed to return to pure wilderness quickly, but too abandoned to maintain as human habitat, these areas exist in a strange limbo. Illegal dumping increases in places with no residents to report it. Invasive species thrive without human intervention to control them. Wildlife moves in, sometimes with dangerous consequences. Alligators occupy swimming pools. Rattlesnakes nest in walls. Wild hogs root through abandoned yards. The interface between human development and nature becomes unstable and hazardous. Meanwhile, the buildings themselves pose environmental risks. Asbestos from old structures flakes into the air. Lead paint leaches into soil. Underground fuel tanks at closed gas stations slowly corrode, threatening groundwater. Septic systems designed for active homes begin to fail when not maintained, potentially contaminating aquifers that serve wider regions. The ghost towns are not just social failures, but environmental time bombs, quietly degrading with consequences that will eventually demand attention and resources. What makes the story of inland Florida's ghost towns so disturbing is how predictable it was, and yet how little was done to prevent it. Scientists had warned for decades about the increasing intensity of hurricanes. Urban planners understood the fragility of communities dependent on single industries. Insurance experts could calculate the unsustainable risk models. Yet, development continued, encouraged by short-term profits and wishful thinking. People bought homes in flood zones and hurricane paths because they were affordable, and politicians approved developments because they generated tax revenue and campaign contributions. Everyone kicked the can down the road, assuming the crisis would happen later, would be someone else's problem, or could be managed with disaster aid when it finally arrived. Now the bill has come due, and it is being paid by people who can least afford it. The families who lost their homes, their communities, their entire way of life were not wealthy speculators or irresponsible developers. They were working people who made reasonable decisions based on the information they had and the options available to them. They are the collateral damage of a system that privatizes profits and socializes losses. Looking at these ghost towns, you cannot help but wonder if this is a preview of America's future. Climate change is not a distant threat, but a present reality reshaping the landscape. As sea levels rise and extreme weather becomes more common, more communities will face the same impossible choice. Rebuild at enormous cost, only to face destruction again, or abandon homes and start over somewhere else. The lesson of inland Florida is that running from the coast does not provide safety if the entire system is unstable. The hurricanes were just the trigger. The real destruction came from cascading failures in insurance, employment, infrastructure, and governance. These failures could happen anywhere, and probably will. Drought-stricken towns in the Southwest, flood-prone communities along rivers, fire-ravaged areas in California. The pattern is the same. Extreme weather events reveal structural weaknesses. Costs become unbearable. People leave, services collapse, and the downward spiral begins. What is happening in inland Florida is not unique. It is a warning. Some argue that these ghost towns represent natural economic evolution, that communities rise and fall based on their viability, and trying to preserve every small town is futile. There is some truth to this perspective. Towns throughout American history have vanished when the industries that sustained them disappeared. Mining towns became ghost towns when the ore ran out. Railroad stops faded when highways bypassed them. This is the nature of economic change, and perhaps fighting it is like fighting the tide itself. But there is something different about what has happened in inland Florida. These towns did not fade because their economic purpose ended. They were destroyed by policy failures and abandoned by systems that should have protected them. The residents were not unwilling to adapt. They were willing to rebuild, to change, to survive, but they were denied the tools to do so. Affordable insurance, adequate disaster aid, investment in infrastructure, support for economic diversification. They were
politicians
sacrificed
accepted
not to
campaign
inevitability,
donations from
but to
developers who
indifference.
built with cartel
The
money.
psychological
City
impact
officials
on those who
approved
lived
zoning
through this
changes
slow-motion
that benefited
disaster
properties
cannot be
purchased with drug
overstated.
profits.
Imagine building a life in a place you believed was safe,
focused on
raising children there,
crime,
establishing
while
roots,
billion-dollar
only to
transactions
watch it
happened in
all slowly
air-conditioned offices
disintegrate
above
over the
their head.
course of 10
The
or
system
15 years.
wasn't broken.
The
It was
grief
working
is profound
exactly
and
as
largely
designed.
unacknowledged.
Everyone got
there are
their
no
cut.
memorial
Everyone
services
benefited.
for dying towns.
And everyone
no
pretended
rituals
not
to
to see
process
what was
the loss of
obvious
community.
to anyone
People
willing
just
to look.
pack up and
But
leave,
wait, because
often
what
with
came
enormous
next
financial
reveals
losses,
just how deep
moving
the
to
corruption ran.
unfamiliar places
The
where they
legitimate
start over as
businesses began to
strangers.
suffer.
The elderly
You remember
who
the
grew up in
family-owned
these towns
restaurants,
and
the
expected to
mom-and-pop
die there,
shops,
faced
the small
displacement in
developers
their
who
final
built
years.
affordable housing.
Veterans
They
who
couldn't
returned
compete.
home from war
How do
to
you
communities
compete
they
against
fought for
unlimited
now
capital?
see those
How does a
communities
legitimate
vanish.
business
Teachers
survive
who
when
educated
criminal enterprises
generations
can
of children
operate at a loss
watch their schools
indefinitely?
close.
Because
The
they're
trauma
not
is
actually trying to
collective,
make
but
money.
experienced
They're
in
trying
isolation.
to clean it.
Each
A
family
restaurant that
suffering
needs
alone,
to show profit
unable to
cannot
see that
beat a
their
restaurant
personal
that needs to
tragedy
show
is
revenue
part of a broader
regardless of
pattern
expenses.
that should have been
A
prevented.
legitimate
Empty
developer
churches
building for
stand as
actual buyers
particularly
can't
powerful
compete
symbols
with a
of
shell
what has been
company
lost.
buying
These
entire
buildings were
buildings
not
with
just
cash
places
just
of
to hold
worship,
them empty.
but community
The honest
centers where
businesses
people
failed.
gathered for
One
weddings,
by one,
funerals,
shuttered,
potlucks, and
bankrupt,
meetings.
defeated
They
by an
anchored
enemy
neighborhoods
they
and
couldn't
provided
even name without
continuity
sounding
across
paranoid.
generations.
The working
Now they
families
sit
felt it
abandoned.
next.
Their steeples
Remember those
still pointing
affordable homes?
skyward,
Those
but their
middle-class
doors locked
neighborhoods
or
where
open to
teachers
the
and
elements.
nurses could buy
Hymnals
houses
decay
and
in
raise
pews.
kids?
Crosses
Gone,
tilt on
priced
altars.
out. When
Baptismal
cartels are
fonts
buying
fill with
properties at
rainwater
30%
leaking
above
through
asking
damaged
price in
roofs.
all-cash
The
deals,
silence in these
regular
spaces
buyers
is
disappear.
profound,
When
almost
investors
sacred in
from
its
shell
completeness.
companies are
You can
purchasing
still
entire
feel the
blocks,
echo of what they
families
once
looking
held.
for homes have
Hundreds
no
of
chance.
voices raised
The
in song,
neighborhoods
crying
transformed.
babies being
What was
blessed,
once a community
mourners finding
became an
comfort,
investment
couples
portfolio.
exchanging vows.
Houses that once
All
held
of that
laughter
human
and
energy and
barbecues
faith has
stood
dissipated,
vacant,
and what
appreciating in
remains is
value
just the
while
shell,
contributing
the
nothing to
physical
the
structure
community.
without the spirit
Miami's
that gave
soul
it
was
meaning.
being purchased and
This
removed,
is the essence
square
of a
foot
ghost
by
town.
square foot.
Not just
the
empty
80s
buildings,
turned to
but the
90s.
absence
The
of the
cocaine
life,
cowboys got
stories, and
arrested or
connections
killed.
that made them
Pablo
matter.
Escobar
As you drive
fell.
through these
the
areas,
Medellin
you
cartel
encounter people
collapsed.
who have chosen
the world
to
thought
stay
Miami's
despite
dirty
everything.
money problem
An
would
elderly
end with the
man
cartels.
maintaining his property,
But that's not
even
how
though
systems
every neighbor
work.
has left.
The infrastructure
a young couple
remained.
who bought a
The
house for
banks
the price
still
of a
knew how
used
to process
car and are
questionable
trying to make a
funds.
life
The
amid
lawyers
the
still
ruins.
knew how to
A
structure
shopkeeper
opaque
keeping his
deals.
store
The
open
real
3
estate
days a
market
week
still
because the
welcomed
remaining
unexplained
population
wealth.
still needs
All that
somewhere to
changed
buy
was the
essentials.
clientele.
These
Russian
people are either
oligarchs replaced
incredibly
Colombian
resilient
cartels.
or incredibly
Chinese
stubborn.
officials with
Perhaps
embezzled
both.
funds
They
replaced
speak of
Mexican
loving the land,
traffickers.
of refusing to be
Venezuelan
driven out,
politicians joined
of holding
Brazilian
on to
criminals.
hope that things
the
might
nationalities
improve.
changed,
But their
the
words
game
often
remained
carry an
identical.
undertone
Miami
of
had
resignation.
become a machine
They
that
know
couldn't
they
be
are
turned
witnessing
off
the
even
end
if
of
someone
something,
wanted to.
that the Florida
It was
they
too
knew
profitable,
is gone
too
and not
embedded,
coming back.
too essential
Yet they
to
remain,
too many people's
partly
fortunes.
from necessity,
By
partly
2000,
from pride,
the problem had
partly from
evolved into
simple
something
inertia.
even more
Where else would they
sophisticated.
go?
The
What
term
would they do
luxury
with
real
properties
estate
worth almost
became
nothing?
synonymous
So
with
they
money
stay,
laundering.
becoming
Miami
characters
led
in
the
a
nation
drama
in
of
cash
decline,
real estate transactions.
witnesses to the slow
Not just
death
led,
of their hometowns.
dominated.
The
A study
economic
revealed that
abandonment of inland
76%
Florida
of condo
contrasts
sales in
sharply
Miami-Dade
with the
County to
continued
shell
development
companies
of coastal
came from
areas.
buyers with
Even
murky
as sea level
identities and
rise
suspicious
threatens to
financial
submerge
backgrounds.
beachfront property within
76%.
decades,
More than
construction
3 out of
continues
every
along the
4
shore.
purchases.
Luxury
Buildings rose with
condominiums
names
rise
like
where
Porsche
scientists
Design
say the
Tower
ocean
and
will be in
Ritz-Carlton
30
residences,
years.
where
The
units sold
explanation
for
is
tens
simple.
of millions.
Coastal
Often
profit
to
generates
limited
immediate
liability
profit,
companies
and the
registered in
long-term
Delaware or
consequences
Wyoming,
are someone
with
else's
nominee
problem.
directors
The
and
market is not
untraceable
rational
beneficial
in the
owners.
face of climate
The
change.
penthouses stayed
It responds
dark.
to
The
present
amenities
demand,
unused.
not
The
future
pools
reality.
empty.
So investment
Vertical
flows to the
ghost towns
coast while the
hovering above
interior
Biscayne
withers.
Bay. The
This
government tried
creates
to
a
respond.
bizarre
The
inversion
Financial
where the
Crimes
most
Enforcement
vulnerable
Network
areas
issued
receive the
geographic
most
targeting
resources,
orders,
and the
requiring
relatively
disclosure
safer
of
interior
beneficial
gets
ownership
nothing.
in luxury
It is
real
a
estate
testament to how
transactions.
broken our
Lawyers
systems
immediately
are,
found
how
workarounds.
short-sighted our
Instead
planning
of
has
one
become,
$20 million
how
purchase,
completely we
they
prioritize
$4 or
profit
$5
over
million
sustainability.
purchases through different
The
entities.
ghost towns also
Instead of
reveal
buying in
uncomfortable
Miami-Dade,
truths
they'd
about
buy in Broward.
inequality and
Instead of
environmental
condos,
justice.
they'd buy homes.
The people
The
left
rules
behind in
created
these
speed
areas
bumps,
are disproportionately
not roadblocks.
poor,
Because
elderly, elderly
fundamentally,
and
the
minority
United
residents.
States wanted
They lack
foreign
the financial
investment,
resources to
wanted
relocate,
capital flowing
the
in,
social capital
wanted
to
the
access
appearance
help,
of a
and the
booming
political
economy.
power to
The
demand
dirty money
attention.
was just the cost
Meanwhile,
of doing
wealthy
business in a
residents of
global
coastal
economy,
areas
or
receive
so the
massive
thinking went.
subsidies
But
in the
here's what
form of
nobody
federal
talks
flood
about:
insurance,
the
beach
human
renourishment
cost,
projects,
the cities that
and
became
infrastructure
unlivable
hardening.
for regular people.
The National
The
Flood
schools
Insurance Program,
underfunded because
designed to
property
make
tax
coverage
revenue
affordable,
came from
has become
vacant
a wealth
units owned by
transfer mechanism
phantoms.
from
The
taxpayers
emergency
to
services
coastal
stretched
property
thin,
owners.
protecting empty
Inland
towers
residents receive
instead
no
of occupied
comparable
neighborhoods.
support.
The
Their
small
suffering is
businesses
quiet.
that closed
Their
because
decline
they couldn't
invisible
afford
to most
rent in a
Americans.
market
Their
inflated
fate
by
considered
criminal
acceptable
capital.
collateral
The artists
damage
and
in the larger
teachers and
economic
nurses
scheme.
and firefighters
This
who
is
left
environmental
because they couldn't
racism
afford to
and
live in the
classism
city
in
they
action,
served.
though
The
rarely
children
discussed
who
in those
grew up
terms.
thinking wealth
Yet,
meant
amid all
emptiness
this
and
desolation,
success meant
there are
secrecy.
moments of strange
the
beauty.
corruption of the American
Abandoned
dream
orange
itself,
groves where wild
transformed
fruit
from
still
a promise
grows,
of opportunity
unpicked and
into
rotting
a
in the
monument
grass,
to greed.
filling the air
Miami
with fermented
today
sweetness.
stands as a warning.
Sunset over
The
empty
skyline
subdivisions,
glitters. The
golden
beaches
light
still
streaming
sparkle.
through broken
The
windows
restaurants
and
still serve
illuminating dust
overpriced
motes like
cocktails
tiny
with
stars.
ocean views.
Morning
But
fog
underneath the
rolling through
glamour,
deserted
the machine
streets,
churns.
giving them an
Every
otherworldly
luxury
quality,
tower is a
as if
question
you have
mark.
stepped into
Every
another
cash
dimension.
sale a potential
Nature's
crime.
reclamation
Every shell
has a certain
company
poetry
mystery.
to it.
Estimates
Flowers
suggest
bloom
that
in
between
cracked
2
parking
and
lots.
5%
Birds
of
nest
global
in
gross
foreclosed
domestic
homes.
product is
Deer
laundered
graze on
annually.
lawns,
That's
returning to
$800
meadow.
billion
The
to
land
$2
does not
trillion.
mourn its human abandonment.
And Miami
It
remains
simply
one of the world's
adjusts,
premier
adapts,
destinations
and
for that
continues.
dirty money.
There is
Not
something
because
humbling
it's
in
easy
this,
anymore.
a reminder
It's
that our
actually quite
towns and
difficult.
cities
But
are
because the
temporary
infrastructure
impositions on a
exists,
landscape
the
that existed
expertise
long
remains,
before us
the
and will
willingness
continue
persists,
long after
and
we are
most
gone.
importantly,
The
because
lessons from
everyone
inland
benefits
Florida's
just
ghost
enough
towns are
to look
clear
away.
for those
The
willing to see
pandemic
them.
revealed even
Climate
more.
change is
When
not a
the world
future
locked
threat,
down,
but a
when
present
borders
reality
closed,
with
when
immediate
normal people
economic
struggled
and
to
social
survive,
consequences.
Miami's luxury real
Insurance
estate
markets
market
cannot
exploded.
function when risks
Record
become too
sales,
high and
record
concentrated.
prices, record
Communities
cash
built on
transactions.
single industries
While
are
families lost
vulnerable
homes
to
to
collapse.
foreclosure,
Government
penthouses
safety nets
sold
are
for
inadequate when
40,
disaster
$50
strikes
million,
slowly rather
while
than
small
suddenly.
businesses
And
shuttered
once a downward
permanently,
spiral
shell
begins,
companies
it
bought
is
entire
incredibly
buildings.
difficult to reverse.
The contrast was
These
obscene,
lessons should
but it was
inform
also
policy
clarifying.
decisions about
It
where we
showed what
build,
Miami
how
had
we
become,
ensure risk,
a place where
how we
crisis
support
for regular
vulnerable
people
communities,
meant
and
opportunity
how we
for money
plan for the
launderers,
climate
where
reality we
human
are
suffering
entering
coincided
rather than the
with
stable
criminal
climate we are
profit,
leaving
where the
behind.
system designed to
But
protect
evidence
citizens
suggests these
protected
lessons will be
capital
learned
instead.
only
The
after
banks
many
paid
more
their fines
communities
and
have been
continued.
sacrificed.
Billions
Only
in
after the
penalties for
crisis is too
facilitating
large
money
to
laundering.
ignore.
But the
By
fines
then,
were just
it will be
another
too
cost
late
of
for
business.
thousands of
A
towns
small
across
percentage
America
of the
that will
profits they
follow
made.
the same trajectory.
No executives went
Prosperity,
to jail. No
disaster,
institutions
decline,
lost their licenses.
abandonment,
The settlement
silence.
agreements included
Standing
neither
in the middle
admission
of an empty
nor
street in
denial
one
of
of these
wrongdoing.
ghost towns,
Legal
you
language
feel the
that means
weight of
everything
all that has
and
been
nothing.
lost and
the
all
machine
that could have
absorbed
been
the fines
prevented.
and
You
kept
imagine
running.
the lives
Because
that were
shutting
lived
it
here.
down
The
would
children
require
who learned to
acknowledging
ride
how
bikes
deep
on
the
this
corruption
sidewalk.
runs.
The
How
families
many
who gathered on these
respected
porches on
institutions are
summer
complicit.
evenings.
How
The
much of
hopes and
Miami's
dreams
wealth is
invested
built
in
on
these
crime.
homes.
And
All of
nobody
it gone
wants to
now.
acknowledge
Not
that.
because it
Not
had
the
to be,
politicians,
but because
not
we
the
made
business
choices
leaders,
as a
not the
society
residents
that
who
led
benefit
here.
from
We
property
chose
values
short-term
inflated
profit
by
over
dirty money,
long-term
not the
sustainability.
nation that wants to
We
believe
chose
its
development
financial
over
system is
caution.
clean. The
We
lawyers
chose
who
to
set up
ignore
the shell
warnings
companies,
until the
still
warnings
practicing,
became reality.
still charging
And the
premium
people
rates,
of these towns
still
are paying the
structuring
price
deals
for
that
our
separate
collective
criminals
failure.
from their crimes
Their
through
ghost
layers
towns
of
stand
legal
as
entities.
monuments to that
The
failure.
accountants who cooked the
Warnings
books,
written in
still
rotting wood
signing
and
audit
crumbling
reports,
concrete.
still sitting
Histories
on boards,
preserved
still
in
teaching at
abandonment.
universities.
Maybe in
The
another
real estate
100
agents
years,
who
when
ask
these
no
structures
questions,
have completely
still selling
returned to
properties,
Earth, new
still
communities will
collecting
build here again,
still posting
learning from
luxury
our
listings on
mistakes.
Instagram,
Or maybe
with
they will
captions
remain
about
empty,
exclusive
cautionary
opportunities
tales
and
about hubris
investment
and neglect,
potential. The
about what
system
happens when we
protects its
forget
own,
that nature
because the
always
system
has the
is
last
its own.
word. If you have
Everyone
felt
is
this kind of
complicit.
change in your own
Everyone
community.
benefits.
If you have watched a
Everyone
town
pretends.
slowly die
You want
or
to know the
wondered what
darkest
climate
secret?
change
We
really
all
looks
know.
like on the ground,
Every person
share
who's
your
paid
story
attention
in the
to
comments.
Miami for the last
These ghost
40
towns
years
exist
knows.
all across
The
America
journalists
now,
have written the
in different
exposés.
forms for different
The investigators
reasons,
have
but
filed
following
the
similar
reports.
patterns.
The academics
and if this
have published
opened your
the
eyes
studies.
to a crisis
The evidence
most people
is
never think about,
overwhelming and
subscribe,
publicly available.
because the next
But
story
knowing
reveals
and
where
acting
all
are
these
different
displaced
things.
families went
Because
and
acting
what is
would mean
happening to
disrupting
those
an
cities
economy,
now. The
destroying
migration from
property
inland
values,
Florida is part of a
acknowledging that
larger
much of
movement
America's
that is
prosperity
reshaping
is
America
built on
in ways
walking
we are
away
only
from crimes
beginning to
committed by
understand.
foreign
The
criminals
ghosts of
with
these
money to
towns
spend.
are not just
It would
memories.
mean admitting
They
that
are
we chose
warnings.
wealth
They
over
are
integrity,
prophecies.
that we
They
sold
are the future,
paradise to the
arriving
highest
ahead
bidder,
of schedule
regardless
in
of where
places
their
we
money
thought
came
were
from.
safe.
That the